Good evening, folks. It's going to be another great show tonight. My name is Tom Russell. I'm your host for Life Without Limits. And before I bring on my guest, we're going to be talking about things I've talked about before. We're going to talk about anxiety. And I think it's going into our third year, dealing with COVID. And if that doesn't create anxiety, I don't know what does. And it's really hit home close to me because my brother, who lives with us, he got COVID, but fortunately, he had his 3 shots. That's 2 shots and a booster, and he had mild symptoms. But what occurred after that was he ended up developing blood clots in his legs and his lung, and he's been in the hospital for about a week now. So I understand what anxiety is because you always worry about, in this case, my brother. And I learned how to deal with it because I don't have control over it. And my guest tonight, Agi Heale, she's from Singapore, and she is a certified professional coach and facilitator. But she wrote a book it's called Generation Panic. And I listened to an audio book, and I was mesmerized by the things that, the things she wrote really made sense. It's common sense things that most people should have, but Aggie kind of just broke it down and were into things that easily digestible. And so I wanted to bring Aggie on she's from Singapore. Thanks for coming on my show, Aggie.
Oh, thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me. And sorry about your brother. It's just crazy times. I'm sorry.
He's in a good spot. He's got a lot of faith, so he's not worried. He's not the kind of person who worries about those things. So I'm going to talk about your career, Aggie, because you started out when you were younger. You climbed the corporate ladder rather quickly. What kind of job were you doing?
So straight out of university, I was in financial services recruitment, and I just climbed quickly. I think it was a booming time. I recruited into compliance in financial services, which back in beginning of 2010 was quite a hot space. And I was headhunted a couple of years in and moved to this startup and just grew and grew with this company as it kind of grew in size and power. And I progressed up the ranks with that. So yeah, there were lots of positives to it. There were lots of things that suited me really well. But alongside that, there was also a lot that I was really struggling with and very adamant on getting through myself and not showing other people.
Were you were engaged to be married then too, right? Around the time that you were climbing your career, and that obviously created more anxiety and chaos for you. Why was it so hard to manage for you?
Good question. I think when I look back, so much that had already happened was almost the kind of the crux, the beast of it. And the wedding was just the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, weddings are stressful at the best of times. I was marrying someone from a different culture. And so we were having 2 different types of ceremonies, one of which I'd never even been to myself. And all of a sudden I was going to be the center of it.
Yeah.
And so when I was first feeling really anxious and having panic attacks, I kind of thought it was related to the weddings and misdiagnosed that there was so much. It was almost like that was the tip of the iceberg. And there was just so much under the surface that I'd almost discredited and didn't realize that I had got to that point. But yeah, there was a lot going on. And I was, 26, trying to keep up with life and all the things like social media, gym, drinks, socializing. It was a fast life.
So on the outside, you're kind of like you want to show the strength on the outside, but on the inside you're breaking down. How did you come to terms with that?
It took a long time, and I think that's a brilliant way to put it, because I really did feel like a duck. On the surface, I was a director. I was managing 3 teams. People were looking up to me, and underneath, I was just scrabbling. My legs felt like they were going at a gazillion miles an hour. How did I come to terms with that? I think a number of ways, but one of the things that just popped into my mind is there was nowhere else for me to go other than accept it. Like I had reached such a point that I had to come to terms with it and build up off that. I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was a part of me, and now it's a huge part of me. You know, like it's a huge part of my identity and what I'm all about. So I think, yeah, I think also another thing that I mentioned in the book is learning to love it. You know, there's can be real positives to that as well. And I think when I started to see it not just 100% negatively, but actually there were parts of it that were kind of cool that I wanted to hold on to, or like have really served me well. That was a good point as well for me to kind of really accept it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that question later on, but you said learn to love it. You learn to love the anxiety, or learn to how can you explain that a little bit more?
I think well, for me anyway, kind of from what I just mentioned, I found it really hard to accept it, and I was so kind of scared of it. I remember kind of waking up and just being so scared that I was going to feel so anxious that I wasn't going to be able to function, or that I was going to have a panic attack, or things were just going to feel too overwhelming. And when I realized that actually there is a good amount of anxiety we can have in our lives, like there is a part of anxiety that keeps us fresh and keeps us on our toes and makes us work harder or makes us prepare even more. Like a little bit of anxiety is kind of a good thing. There's this story about Bruce Springsteen before a concert, and he's about to go on and he's like throwing up everywhere. He's like, yeah, this means I'm ready. You know, that anxiety showed him that he was ready to perform. He was ready to like go out and do what he does. And so I think if we can take all the goodness from it, I mean, that can serve us. That can work well for us.
I have to remember that next time I throw up.
Yeah,
that's a good thing. So can you explain what a panic attack is, at least for you, what it was like for you?
Yeah, so for me, and to be honest, they're pretty kind of common symptoms, but in like varying degrees or varying kind of makeups that people report. But for me, I first and foremost, I felt my heart rate, you know, through the roof. My palms began to sweat. And I remember just feeling like, you know, when you know, like all the colors draining from your face. And all of a sudden I couldn't think straight, like incredibly simple decisions, things that shouldn't and haven't historically felt overwhelming just became just too much. So for me, it was a very physical reaction, like not being able to think, the physical body like kind of shaking and feeling a bit out of control. And you know, a lot of people report that. A lot of people say it feels like they're having a heart attack, or they feel like their body is kind of giving up on them. You know, for me, it was a very scary experience. I remember sat there and going, you know, what on earth is happening? Like, what on earth is my body doing right now? I'm not in control of it.
Now, you said you're trying to hide it. Why is it wrong to ignore your symptoms of anxiety?
Well, for me, it meant that I was having panic attacks. And so having ignored it and having missed all these like glaring red flags in my face, I got to a point where I was essentially like my body had shut down. I wasn't able to operate in a way that I normally did. And so by missing all of those things, I essentially got to a panic attack. Whereas, you know, if we think about the good side of anxiety, if you can manage it so that it's like working for you and you're not kind of, you know, if you imagine like going up a slope or a roller coaster, we haven't tipped over into something that's very hard to come back from, the better. Because ultimately, when you get into an actual panic attack, there's not a huge amount you can do. You can control your breathing. I mean, we can talk about this in a bit, but like there's a number of very real things that you can do in the moment, but ultimately your body's taken over. It's protecting you. It's trying to help you survive.
Now, was your thought process, or is it normal thought process of people who don't want to show signs of anxiety because they're worried about what other people think about them?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I was part of that as well. You know, I feel like I just wanted to prove that I could do it all. And I was kind of so intent on keeping things like on the surface good. So even when I was really struggling at my kind of you know, my hardest, darkest times, it was a very small group of people who knew what I was struggling with. And having obviously now released the book and I talk about it very openly, so many of my friends are like, I had no idea. Like some of my best friends are saying, I just didn't realize that you were struggling. I didn't realize that you were going through this. But I don't know, maybe that was just part of my kind of journey of how I needed to get through it and how it made me, process it all. But at the time I was very intent on keeping up with the Joneses. That's what it felt like.
But eventually you decided, you know what, I have to need to make a career change. I would assume that had to be quite difficult. That's a quite difficult decision because I mean you were climbing this corporate ladder, you're doing well and everything, you're married and everything, and then I said, hey, I gotta pivot my life into something else. How scary was that?
It was very scary, and a couple of things led to that. I remember getting back from the wedding, from our honeymoon, and being like, oh my gosh, I'm still struggling. Like I thought this was going to like magically disappear and I was going to feel freaking amazing. And actually I was still really struggling. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's something bigger at play here that I hadn't even realized. I hadn't kind of got to grips with. And so I actually stayed in the role after we got married for about a year. But it got to a point that I just realized that I just didn't want to work there. Like the way the company was moving and where I was moving felt like in different directions. And I just kind of thought, if I fast forward my life, am I still going to be working for these guys in 10 years time? Am I going to go through hopefully mat leaves and my life and I'm just going to wake up when I'm, I don't know, 40 and still be doing this? I'd also felt like I'd kind of reached quite a heady height already, where else was I going to go? But I remember when I resigned, and I think the hardest thing was I didn't know what I was going to do, but so many people couldn't understand it. They were like, what? You were doing so well. Like you were flying, you were doing all of this. And to be like, yes, I know. And I've also decided to step away. That was very hard. It was almost harder to deal with other people's reactions to that than how I was doing or how I was feeling.
Do you feel like you made a mistake at all?
Oh my God, not one iota. No, not one iota. And you know what? I mean, whenever people are asking about whether they should resign or not, do it in a way that makes you feel safe. I'd saved up some money and kind of had been thinking about the decision. It wasn't like overnight. Yeah. But also I think I had real confidence in myself. I was just, I almost like my default backup was I could walk into another recruitment firm tomorrow. Like I feel confident of that. I might not be at the same level or earning the same money, but I could go and find a job somewhere. And I'm like, I'd be happy making coffee in Starbucks if that's what it came to. And so having that kind of level of, I'll make something work. I can come back to this if it doesn't work. But I don't know, what if? Like, what's the worst that can happen?
So you become a life coach. I mean, that's entirely different than what your career was. So why a life coach?
So yes and no. There were definitely some similarities, as in recruitment is a lot of it is kind of really understanding how people work and what they're driven by, their values, what they want out of life, and then trying to marry that up with companies, or not go sideways, but actually meet in the middle. And a lot of my role with the three teams that I was managing was around mentoring and coaching and kind of bringing them up. But for me, the story was, so after I resigned, I was like, great, I'm just going to take off 6 months and work out what's going to make me happy, like where am I going to feel fulfilled, and kind of go exploring. And I tried, I mean, everything you can possibly think of. I was like, yes, I'll do it. I'll try it. I'll give it a whirl. So tried everything from like ceramics to yoga, financial statements, coding. I was like, yeah, I'll just try it all. And one of the courses that I did was this coaching for business course with City University in London. And I remember I was just sitting there. It was always like on a really dreary, London in kind of January, February is pretty miserable and kind of grey. And I remember sitting there at 9:30 at night and just thinking, oh my God, this is so cool. You can make a career out of this. Like, I can't believe that you get paid to do this. This is just, it felt like everything kind of clicked into place. Everything felt like, oh, wow, this is absolutely where I want to be.
So this is you made this decision and everything, and then eventually came this idea that for some reason you felt that you wanted to write this book, Generation Panic. How did that come about?
I got to this point where, and kind of during this time, that for myself, I had pulled together all this information and used all these different things, and then had experience with it from a kind of coaching angle as well. And for myself, I wanted one place that I could return to, because there are absolutely still times that I can feel on the back foot or anxious in some way. And I wanted to have everything that I had learnt within, two leaves of a book cover. And so it was more just like bringing it all together for myself. And then I actually sat on it. So I wrote it about 5 years ago now, and I just sat on it. I just thought, well, I'll just keep it for myself. And then I got to this point where, anxiety it was everywhere. And I was like, as you said at the very beginning, they're simple, they're accessible. It's kind of common sense, a lot of it. But I didn't need to have the experience that I had. That could have absolutely been avoided if I had Generation Panic, or that's my belief anyway. And so shame on me if it wasn't making those tools available to people so that they didn't need to feel as horrendous as I did. They don't need to have such an outsized reaction and such a physical one. There's an easier way. There's things to do that everyone can do that will make them feel better.
Well, let's talk about the book then, because in the book you were saying came up with 100 different ways to deal with anxiety, and we're obviously not going to be able to cover all of them. It'd be nice if I had a 4-hour show. But let's talk about some things. First thing I want to talk about is fight or flight response. What are some of those symptoms?
So fight or flight, if we look back to our ancestors, the cavemen, and what happened kind of physically and emotionally within them, is that they would have a very real threat in front of them, such as like a saber-toothed tiger or a poisonous berry. And their bodies and brains would essentially shut down the parts that were not needed and just kind of almost hone in and get this kind of laser sharp focus on survival and how they can keep themselves safe. So for example, which is why your heart rate increases, so that, or your vision becomes kind of laser point focus, is that, if you were physically met with a tiger, you would want your heart rate to increase. You would want to be able to run as fast as you could, or to hide, or to fight it, to be ready for that. The problem is that amazing response that our body does has almost just like not updated through the years. So where I was in, facing a metaphorical saber-toothed tiger in front of me, but there was no tiger. Like my body and brain had kind of almost tricked it into thinking that there was a threat in front of me. And so it was reacting in quite a clever way. Like, it's quite amazing what our bodies can do. Started pumping around that adrenaline and that cortisol, but it wasn't needed. Like, I wasn't under attack. And so a lot of this is almost like rewiring our brain, retraining our brain that we're not under attack. We don't need to respond as though there's a saber-toothed tiger, or, the building's falling on top of us, or there's a poisonous berry. We don't need to have that. We need to be able to control, think clearly and calmly, and then respond accordingly. Much more helpful than like going into complete kind of crazy fight or flight response or freeze.
One of the things one of the best parts about this book, and we talked about this when we first talked, and I saw this at another show you were on with Lynn McLaughlin, but you talked about the heartbeat tapper. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, so the heartbeat tapper is one of my favorite tools. And what I love about it is that it's really simple and you can take it wherever you are. So it's not something that you need to do something wacky. You can do it in a meeting room or at the dinner table, just underneath if you don't want anyone to see. And all it quite simply is if you've got your wrist, and obviously you can kind of measure your pulse down the middle, but just putting 2 fingers and just tapping up and down, but ideally at a slower rate than your heart. And the kind of principle of it is, I'm not sure if you're aware, in Asia, but they have these Chinese boat races, like the dragon boat races. And they have someone who stands at the front with a huge drum, and they just go boom, boom, and they set the rhythm, they set the pace for the rest of the boat to follow in line with. And so the same principle comes to this. Your heart really impacts how the rest of your body is doing. So if your heart rate is slower, it sends messages to the rest of your body that you're safe and that you're not under attack. And so all this is just, in a moment, if you feel your heart rate increasing, or you just are in a moment and you want it to be a little bit slower, just going up and down at a slightly slower rate. It's almost the same as that pace setter of the dragon boat, that I'm okay. I can slow things down. And it's amazing. It just has like a real, I don't know if you had a go at it, but for me anyway, it feels like a real grounding, like a settling.
So what practical, I can't think of the word events, or how can you use this practically in situations where because I think you talked about this doing like a speaking engagement before you get up there and talk.
Oh yeah, I mean, public speaking for so many people is like,
there I am right there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it comes up time and time again, even with my clients now who are super confident or amazing, but then will still be like, I don't want to talk in front of anyone. I don't want to be up on stage. And so again, that's a perfect example of when the fight or flight response, that survival response, kicks in, because you feel like you're under attack in some way, which is why people either try and like get out of that situation, like they might rush through what they're saying, or they might freeze and completely forget where they're at. It's just indication that we are in a heightened state of alertness. And so before you're doing any sort of public speaking, I think the preparation is key. Again, a little bit of anxiety is good. It's kind of keeping you on your toes. It's keeping you fresh. But if you can bring in things like the heartbeat tapper, just to slow things down. And even if you're, for example, even if you're in a auditorium about to get up onto a stage, I mean, you can do that in your seat. No one needs to know. This is not, you're not kind of getting up and having to do a kind of, I don't know, a jazz hands or something. It can be very kind of intimate or personal and just on your own to just really slow things down. So I really like that one. But yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of different things that you can do to.
I've actually used it since reading the book and actually talking to you over the course of the last month and a half. I don't know, we talked a long time ago. But you also, in the book, you recommended using cue cards in dealing with anxiety. Why is that important?
So going back to what I said a little bit before, that it's really hard to think clearly when you're actually in the panic. There's lots that we can do in the preparation to put us in the best place so that we don't tip over. But once you kind of have tipped, it's very, very hard because your body's taken over. It's kind of then in that natural response, it's very hard to come back down from it. And what I would find is that I would be in a panic attack, and all of a sudden, all of the things that are very obvious or rational kind of went out the window. And so actually my mum started with cue cards originally of just, I mean, I think we started with like, I don't know, 10 or 15 that just were super clear. They were on different pieces of card, and on each one was just very simply, it's like something to remember. So even like on one of the cards, it might say, use the heartbeat tapper, because you, in that moment, in that panic, or this is what I found, I wouldn't remember to do the heartbeat tapper. That my sole focus was just around, oh my God, what's happening? How do I get, it's not thinking clearly. And so knowing that you've got these cards that say, use the heartbeat tapper, take some deep breaths. Remember, this will pass. Remember, a panic attack can only last for 15 minutes. Remember that things will get better. Remember, you are safe. It's just a reminder. And what I encourage people to do in the book is work out what works for them. So people have different phrases that work well for them, or different, I don't know, like different things that make them feel calm. So even if it's like, think of my dog, or remember that beach that made me feel really calm. And so you're just kind of calling upon these different resources in a moment to help ground you and center you. But kind of what's important about the cue cards is that it's written when you're with it, when you're feeling like rational, that these things can work. And so that in the moment you have a breakdown of really powerful things that can help you and will kind of put your feet back on the ground. That's how I like to think of it.
Now people have the fear of the unknown, things we can't control. How do you take the fear out of that equation?
Good question. And fear of the unknown is something that's at an all-time high at the moment, because things are so unpredictable, and the only thing that we can guarantee is that things are going to be changing, and things are unknown at the moment. Again, a couple of like practical things like the heartbeat tap or the breathing, but also it's almost leaning back into things happen. And if you are in your most resourceful and your best state and able to think clearly, you can handle whatever comes your way. We're gonna face challenges. We're gonna have hard moments that come. For example, you said with your brother, mm-hmm. that was a complete unknown for you, a week ago. Yeah. And yet you're here and you're being open and you're talking about it, and you're resourceful enough to kind of try and work through it methodically. And actually, as we build up those experiences, I think that's another point is we never give ourselves enough credit of what we've already done. We faced a gazillion unknown moments. Think of all the unknown moments that you've already got through. We kind of brush past them like, oh yeah, I'll come up with this excuse for that or this reason for that. But actually, if you slow it down and really appreciate what you've already done and what resources you have available to you, you can get through anything. And obviously, like calling on your support network and realizing that you've got people around you. And at the very least, I guarantee that everyone has a fear of the unknown in some proportion. You're not on your own.
And I think one of the things with the anxiety, I think a lot of people get they stay in their comfort zone. Why is that so much? Why is that so dangerous in trying to overcome anxiety?
I wrote a chapter on getting out of your comfort zone, and I really struggled with the chapter because I feel like it's this really fine balance between, it's like finding that perfect sweet spot of, there's an element of being in your comfort zone is good. It's like, it can be a place you can recharge, particularly if you feel under threat. A lot of the time, being in your comfort zone is a place that you're not under threat, and it's safe. If I picture my comfort zone metaphorically, it's like this big cozy armchair. That's a super nice place to be. Whereas I think of outside of my comfort zone, it feels like Mordor and Lord of the Rings, or like craggy rocks and much more scary. Mm-hmm. And so that can take a lot of energy to journey out into that. The problem with staying in your comfort zone is that obviously things just become less and less. Like your resilience, your tolerance level for trying new things or putting yourself out there becomes less and less and less. So, that's what I really struggled with. It's like having enough of the re-energizing, plugging back in to kind of boost yourself up, but also enough of venturing out and trying new things and seeing where that gets you. And so I think the reader has to be really honest with themselves of when they're playing it too safe, or if they're being too daring. Like if you set unrealistic, I don't know, I'm going to go out and I'm going to perform to 3,000 people on karaoke tonight, that would tip me over the edge. There has to be a reality to you kind of get what I'm saying? It has to
Yeah,
find
yeah.
like
And
a balance.
I think the one of the biggest things about the comfort zone, getting out of your comfort zone, is I think a lot of people feel like they don't like to fail, and they don't want to have that out in front of people. Hey, I failed, or they think that they failed when they actually didn't, because they actually did something. I think that's a part of the anxiety that people get caught up with, that they don't want to live a life of failure. But a failure is something that is part of life. I mean, if you're not failing, you're not doing anything, right?
Yes. And, that's a brilliant point, because we all have this negativity bias. For example, if you push your comfort zone and you try something else, I guarantee that the majority of people will be like, oh, well, I can tell you exactly what went wrong with all of that. Like, I can tell you all the places that it didn't go well and where I failed. And yet, what I encourage the reader to do is really sit down and think like, okay, but what are we celebrating, or what went really well? And yes, some place might have gone wrong, but what have I learned from that? What can I take forward to the next time? And if instead we kind of switch it and look at it with that mindset, Carol Dweck has done some amazing work on the growth mindset, just having that kind of like inquisitive, hey, what can I do better? How can I improve that? That can be very helpful, because we're naturally drawn to like, oh, well, I completely screwed that up, so I'm never going to try that again.
Well, I did that when I played baseball when I was younger. Even now, I look at certain things that happened when I played baseball, and I focus on things I did wrong, rather than all the things I did right. And it's counterproductive. It just doesn't make sense. So
Yes.
about anxiety, when you try to hide it, how do you avoid thinking that you're the only one experiencing anxiety, that you're not alone?
This is a really tricky one, because for me, I felt incredibly alone. Like, I remember feeling like I was the only one going through it, and everyone else seemed so put together and like they were kind of smashing their lives, and I was the one who was really struggling. And the best thing, obviously I wouldn't wish it, but like one of the best things about writing this book is that everyone struggles. If they might have better tools to manage it, they might have better resources to kind of ride that wave, but everyone to some extent faces anxiety. And it's amazing, the people who have come up to me or told me about reading the book and be like, oh, I really struggle with that. I had no idea, not dissimilar to people with me. So I'm hoping to give people confidence through my experience of talking about this so much and hearing people's stories and experiences. It really is everywhere. It's just how well people manage it. And so you really aren't alone. I think kind of proof is in the pudding. People, perhaps maybe that's a good start of like pushing out of your comfort zone, is to go and talk to someone and see whether your friends or your family or a colleague has also faced something similar. And then it's like reassurance, it's not just me. There are other people struggling, and there's some really simple, easy things that I can do to make it better, to make it happier, make it easier.
And I think you can relate to the where you were with your career, is whether it's career or life or anything else. I think a lot of people have a hard time developing boundaries in every avenue of their life. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so boundaries is another chapter in the book, and boundaries is I even just had a coaching call with a client, and we were talking about a lack of boundaries, and the lack of, when you don't have boundaries, it leads to resentment, frustration. You make assumptions because you're assuming like, this is the story that I'm telling myself about the other person, or how we're interacting with one another. And I think what it really comes down to is not only being clear on what your boundaries are and what you need, and also being able to communicate that. Because if you are clear, it's going to lead, it's a win-win. It can feel intimidating to have those conversations. It can feel really hard to speak to loved ones or people who are important to you about, actually, this is the way that works for me. But I think in doing so, it leads to like far more positive outcomes. It leads to better relationships, better communication. there's been tons of studies about how like the breakdown of everything is on communication. And so boundaries is merely the communication of that.
Because I think the biggest thing for me is, I'm sure you can relate to this, is it's so hard to say no. It really is. And I've learned that over the course of time, is, my time is valuable. And if I continue saying yes, I lose my identity. I lose, function, because I end up doing things I really don't want to do. And I am certain that creates a lot more anxiety in a lot of people.
Absolutely. And I feel that too. This is a big part of being able to say no and yes to things. So there's also an element of like pushing yourself out there, kind of back to the comfort zone piece of you've got to feel when things are right to say yes to, when to challenge yourself. But usually when you need or should say no, like there's some sort of internal reaction that's like, oh, this feels not right, but I'm already like down the path of saying yes. I think this is definitely something that I've struggled with as well. Like I'm a natural kind of people pleaser, and I just want to be like, yeah, of course I'll do that. I'll help out. But I have to check I did it the other day. I got approached about something, and I remember, good learning for me, even afterwards, I was so apologetically saying no. I was like, I'm so sorry, but I couldn't, and actually it's just like, no, that doesn't work for me. I should have been stronger in the way that I was communicating that, of like, actually, these are my boundaries and this is what's important to me for this year. And that doesn't fit into that. That's okay. I don't need to be worried about your judgment of that. So yeah, I'm still learning too.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. I've come across that, trying to say no and regretting saying no because of how they reacted to it. But you also wrote in one of the chapters about overcoming anxiety. You have these saboteurs. They try to take over your life. How do you recognize that and remove that from your aspect of your life?
This is probably the chapter that or like the concept that I would most encourage someone to work with a coach on, because so like the saboteurs are like those limiting beliefs, or like, that little pesky voice in our head that whispers sweet nothings that's not actually that helpful, like, oh, you're not good enough, or you can't do that, or why would they want to hang out with you anyway? So like that kind of voice. But what's scary is that voice can, like, without realizing it, interweave into our internal dialogue. And so it's very hard sometimes to be able to be like, that voice is actually not hugely positive. It's not serving me, but there is like a wiser, a more resourceful part of me. And being able to kind of separate them out is usually easiest to do with a coach, because it's easier. Like if you were telling me like, oh, I'm not good enough to go for that podcast show and be interviewed by, that would be an example that someone else would be like, no, you can. And like, I can hear that voice. Let's take that voice out. Let's look at it. What does it look like? Let's personify it and separate it from your internal dialogue. But yeah, those voices, what's scary about them is they become like our beliefs and the way that we view ourselves. And they're kind of like this undercurrent that we really trust, even though they often aren't really that helpful. They don't really serve us. Interestingly, just on a side note, like there can be positives to our saboteurs or those gremlins. They have like 2% of goodness. So there might be like something that, they've obviously been created to protect you in some way or keep you safe. And so if you can kind of get back to that root part of why they're there and what they're trying to do, and like take the pureness of that without like the additional overdrive, that can be helpful. But I think there's a couple of really good books on it, so check them out. But that would probably be where I'd most advise someone to work with someone else.
I think on the same lines, we're talking about saboteurs and everything. We are our own worst critics, right? Because we constantly batter ourselves all the time. How do you not be so judgmental about yourself?
So a number of different ways. And they're all kind of outlined in the book. Two things that immediately jumped into my mind is one, there's a chapter on connecting with your best self. You know, it's that part of you that's wise and compassionate and knows the way forward and can really like boost you up and make you feel really good. And like, you know, when we were saying about saying no, is, you know, there's a part of you that knows that's probably not right for you, but how can you like really have confidence and lean on that voice rather than this one who's like, say yes, say yes, say yes, say yes. So it's like having an awareness that that is happening, but then also having the resources behind that to like lean upon whichever is going to work best for you. And another huge part that I bang on about, and I see time and time again, and I was also a part of, you know, like I remember like having an awesome billing month, or I'd just been promoted and I was like, okay, great, next, you know, what else? What's the next mountain I'm going to climb? And I think this is, I see this time and time again of like, actually, let's just pause. And like, if we look back, what are we celebrating and what's gone well and what are we proud of? And that can help you as well, I think.
I think you also talk about, you know, one of the great chapters was trying to get deep within yourself, and there's the power of silence, and how you succeed in dealing with anxiety. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the power of silence, and this is something that I've also struggled with. As you can probably tell, I'm pretty like chatty and like I get a lot of energy from that. And so for me, with that, it's a natural doing energy. You know, it's like a kind of active forward momentum movement kind of energy. And actually, you know, we're human beings, we're not human doings. And so there's this being part that's like slower and softer and has more silence and more space and more breathing room. And, you know, that's definitely a muscle that I've had to work on over the past few years of, particularly as a coach, you know, how do I create that space? How do I make sure that these, you know, if there's silence, then I'm not just like jumping in to fill it. So I'm just kind of leaning back into it and seeing what comes. And you know what, I remember when I first started training, I remember kind of almost playing games with myself, like, okay, if I can try and stay silent for 10 seconds, would it be horrendously uncomfortable? And I might get to 9 seconds and they already come up with something else. Like it would have been a disservice of me to jump in and ruin their train of thought or like what they felt was important to say. And so silence is really important. It's where we like run through our thoughts and make sense of things and pull things together. And yeah, so that's been a muscle that I've like really enjoyed strengthening, and I've learned loads from. And you can change. Like I'm naturally energized, but I think I've also got that part to me. And so you can change for your listeners if you want or need to.
I don't remember whether it was in Lynn's show. Lynn's show was Taking the Helm, by the way. It's an excellent show. I think Agi will agree. Whether it was on that show or read in the book or this discussion that we made, you had a hard time meditating, right?
Oh, yeah. It's so hard. I remember people would say, oh, just sit down and do the Headspace app, or like just do some meditation. I remember sitting there being like, oh my God, what am I doing? Like I can't control my mind's running so fast. And do you know what? That was also an interesting experience, because I remember being like, I don't get it. Like I'm not understanding this. And then that kind of almost that saboteur voice cropped in of like, well, everyone else can do it. What's wrong with you that you're not able to? And so again, like the beauty of this book, obviously I'm biased, but like the reader gets to choose. I'm not saying like, okay, if you want to stop feeling panicky or anxious, if you meditate for 3 hours a day, you're going to be amazing. The reader can decide, actually, I want to meditate for 3 hours a day, or that doesn't resonate with me. I'm going to kind of jump into some other tools. And so the power is with the person, because, you know, it's all very well me telling you, Tom, okay, go and do these things, but you're going to know what's best for you. Like you're going to know what's going to resonate most or feel best and like give you the biggest outcome. Mm-hmm. But yeah, meditation is definitely something that I'm working on.
I can't do it. I can't do it, but that's just me. We only got a couple more minutes. I think one of the last things I want to talk about that I struggle with, I think most everyone does, is in this digital society. How do you do a digital detox?
Oh, this is something I'm with you on as well. So many different ways. I mean, I think again, it's the awareness. What I found scary for myself is that I was reaching for my phone or scrolling kind of almost unconsciously. Like before I realized it, my phone was in my hand. And so even just having the awareness that that's something that happens for you. And then trying to create, it's almost like boundaries, really, isn't it? Like trying to create boundaries of what works for you. So whether that's no screens after this time, or putting your phone to charge in a different room, or I mean, Google it, there's like a gazillion tips. But I think the first thing is like an awareness that it's happening, then an acceptance that it's happening. Like I found that hard. Like, oh no, I don't have a problem with my phone. Actually, no, I probably do.
Yeah.
And then realizing like what I needed. And again, like that's other things you can apply different parts of the book to, you know, even something like Saboteurs. There's going to be a saboteur, and well, for me anyway, that's like, oh, pick up your phone. Has anyone texted? Has anyone done this? Have you got any email? Actually, I need to quieten that voice and bring up my wiser, more kind of like worldly voice.
So, and again, the book is called Generation Panic. And speaking of the book, you don't just wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to write 100 tips on how to deal with anxiety. How did you come up with the theme and to have the bravery to want to do something like that? You know, because you didn't come in with a ton of experience, like psychological experience and training and all this sort of stuff. How did you come up with the idea to do like this, a book like this?
It was just really from what I needed. And I remember, you know, particularly when I was in financial services recruitment, I was super time poor, incredibly impatient, and wanted things that were just going to work. And I also wanted more options than just go and meditate, because that really just didn't work for me on a number of levels.
Yeah.
And so the kind of easy dip in and out, bite-sized chunks of this, like the style of it, and being super accessible and easy to read and access, was like a really key part of it for myself. And I just thought, like, what am I waiting for? I don't know. That saboteur, I had to quieten down and, you know, make sure that I was like, actually, this is a really important book. This could, if this helps one person who I don't know, it's worth it. And I've got those emails, you know, like I've got those messages. And so, yeah, I'm so thrilled that I've done it. For anyone who's ever thinking about doing anything daring or different, like, again, what's the worst that can happen? I mean, it could have just been my mum who bought it, and then I don't know.
How can people find your book?
Oh, it's everywhere. So like Amazon, Book Depository, Barnes and Noble, Waterstones. I also record an audiobook, so that would be on Audible, Kindle, a number of different places.
I recommend anybody who's listening to this or watching the show on YouTube that if you're going through anxiety, this is something that's very practical. You read a lot of different books about dealing with anxiety, but this one is one of the most practical ones I've ever read. How can people reach you?
Reach out anywhere. LinkedIn, Instagram, it's Agi Heale. My company here is called Westbourne Associates, or there's a Generation Panic website as well, actually.
Yeah, it's the first name is AGI, and then the last name is HEALE.
Yeah.
So, Agi, thanks so much for coming on my show. I learned quite a bit. I'm not as anxious anymore. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
I can breathe. I'm doing the heart tapper, folks. I'm doing the heart tapper. I'm going to use that when I talk again. So thanks again for coming on my show. And as I end on my shows, I want everyone to smile infectiously, laugh genuinely, love unconditionally, live courageously. I believe in all of you. Have a great week, folks.